I don't know about the other group, but we had a scintillating discussion uh, in our group. Um, Perhaps maybe we can spend a little more time on that at the very end. So Stuart, I guess this is part two, and this is the heavy lifting, the substantive, the stuff that gets in all the textbooks, I guess.
All right, so I'd like to get my PowerPoint back up there again, please. So the convention got down to business with Madison's Virginia Plan, which is presented to the convention by Virginia's Governor Edmund Randolph on May 29th. So the Virginia Plan, written by Madison, endorsed by the Virginia delegation, introduced by the governor of Virginia, Edmund Randolph. The Virginia Plan proposed a national government of people, not a confederation of states. There would be a bicameral legislature with representation in both houses based on free population or taxes paid, with the lower house electing the upper house. Congress would have the power to veto state laws that conflicted with the Constitution, and there would be an executive judicial council of revision to review and veto bills before they passed into law. For 3 weeks, the convention debated the Virginia Plan in the Committee of the Whole. Whenever the convention went into the Committee of the Whole, Washington stepped down and Nathaniel Gorham of Massachusetts chaired the proceedings. In the end, the Virginia Plan emerged triumphant with only a few changes. One big change: the state legislatures would elect the upper legislative house instead of the lower house electing the upper legislative house. That's a defeat for Madison, because he saw poorly designed state governments as the problem. The state legislatures are too short-sighted. For Madison, the states encroached on Congress's power. They invaded each other's turf. They violated the rights of minorities within their borders. And by the way, these men, when they're thinking about minorities, they're not really thinking so much about racial minorities, because so many of them are slaveholders. You know, they're thinking about religious minorities or propertied minorities. But for Madison, the states are the problem. So let's not have them play a hand in this new federal government. Let's remove the states from the equation. Another really big change to the Virginia Plan is the addition of the 3/5 clause. Enslaved people will count as 3/5 of free people towards representation in Congress. This 3/5 clause gets applied to both houses of Congress. And why? Many delegates believe that a legislature must represent not just people, but also property. Representation should be based not just on how many people a state has, but how much property they own. And the South has this peculiar type of property, enslaved people, that they wanted to have represented. The South wants slaves to count 5/5 of people. The North wants them to count 0/5 of people towards representation. They compromise at 3/5. The 3/5 clause was introduced by James Wilson of Pennsylvania and seconded by Charles Pinckney of South Carolina. So that's a large state delegate and a deep South state delegate. Then a coalition will back this revised Virginia Plan, a coalition of large states and deep South states. The large states: Virginia, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts. The deep South states: North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. That's 6 states. That's a majority of the convention. The big states get representation based on population. the Deep South states get the 3/5 compromise. And that leaves the small states an isolated minority in the convention. And so Madison is riding high here. He won't budge an inch. He becomes too overbearing, and he forces the small states to come together in opposition. And so on June 15th, William Paterson of New Jersey presents the New Jersey Plan, or the small state plan, as an alternative to the Virginia plan. Now, there's some small state delegates who favor a very powerful federal government, provided that they have a strong voice in it, especially New Jersey and Delaware delegates. And Madison's intransigence drove these small state nationalists to ally with the anti-nationalists behind the New Jersey plan. And so when the New Jersey plan is introduced, John Dickinson turns to Madison and he says, now you see the consequences of pushing things too far. You were too stubborn, you provoked a backlash from the small states. So the New Jersey plan, keep a confederation, keep one vote per state in a unicameral legislature, add executive and judicial branches to the confederation, grant Congress the power to regulate commerce. But a lot of the revenue is still going to come from requisitions on the states, and that is still going to be based on population. And so under the New Jersey plan, Delaware and Virginia would have equal representation in Congress, but Virginia is going to pay a lot more in requisitions because of its big population. And so it seems to me the large states were just never going to agree to this. I agree with Michael Klarman, who calls the New Jersey plan, quote, a bargaining ploy to get state equality in one house of a bicameral legislature. The bottom line, the small states demand state equality in one house of the legislature. On June 18th, Hamilton delivered a long speech that helped to kill the New Jersey plan. Hamilton praised monarchy as the best form of government and questioned the viability of Republican government. Hamilton called for an incredibly powerful central government with a president and a Senate that would serve for good behavior, or in other words, life. Some argue that Hamilton's plan was not serious. It was simply intended to make the Virginia plan look reasonable in comparison. But Hamilton was serious in that he wanted the American government to come as close to monarchy as possible. The New Jersey plan is voted down after only 4 days, on 19 June. But the small states, they drew a line in the sand. They wanted state equality in one house of the legislature. This impasse over representation lasts throughout June and into July, and it threatens to break up the whole convention. I mean, it gets ugly. At one point, Rufus King, who's a big state guy from Massachusetts, he looks right at the little state guys from Delaware and says, you know, we can do this the big state way based on population, or we can all go home right now. Now, that's supposed to be a threat to the little states like Delaware. You know, Delaware really doesn't want to be a separate nation. But the Delaware guys were not going to be intimidated, and so one of them, Gunning Bedford, looks right back at King and says, fine, let's go home right now. Delaware will take the hand of a foreign power. In other words, Delaware will ally itself with a foreign nation for protection. Well, those are fighting words. I mean, that's the founders' worst nightmare, that the states break up into separate nations. They have to militarize to protect themselves. They ally with foreign powers. America becomes periodically torn apart by wars like Europe, and we're back on the road to tyranny. So it gets so ugly that Ben Franklin, of all people, calls for a minister to come in and pray with the delegates. Franklin, the man of science and enlightenment, seeking divine intervention. That's how ugly it gets. Well, the Connecticut delegates start hinting at a compromise. And so the convention calls a grand committee of a delegate from each state, a grand committee of 11 to handle this representation issue. That grand committee gets called when one of the Georgia delegates changes his votes to generate enough votes to call this committee, Abraham Baldwin of Georgia. So a grand committee of 11, a delegate per state, chaired by Elbridge Gerry. And if you look at the membership of that committee, the committee is stacked. From the large states, all of the delegates are compromisers. From the small states, all of the delegates are hardliners. And who's left off the committee? Madison. And so the composition of this committee bodes well for the small states. This committee proposes the Great Compromise of July 16th. The House will be based on population, the Senate, state equality. Large states win in the House, small states win in the Senate. That passes the Great Compromise, or the Connecticut Compromise, on July 16th, when Massachusetts deadlocked and North Carolina changed its vote over from the large states to the small states. The Great Compromise created what Madison would later call a compound republic. It's part national, part federal. The House of Representatives is national, it's elected by the people. The Senate is federal, it's elected by the states. And what the Senate does is it gives the states a check. It protects the states as states. It doesn't just protect the little states, it protects the states because the state legislatures elect the Senate. And so nothing can become a law unless it's passed by a majority of the states through the Senate and a majority of the people through the House. So this Great Compromise of July 16th is a turning point, a milestone in the convention. From then on, it's clear the convention is going to agree on a constitution. It's just a matter of ironing out the details, which will be very time consuming, but there is light at the end of the tunnel. From then on, the small state nationalists support a strong central government. People like William Patterson, John Dickinson. From then on, the big state nationalists are wary of a powerful Senate that will be controlled by the states. And so the big state nationalists want to shift some of the Senate's powers to the president. Appointment power, treaty power, that sort of thing. People like Madison and Wilson. And this Great Compromise is a devastating defeat for Madison. It's a bitter defeat that he did not want to accept at first. But that's just the beginning of Madison's defeats. Next, Madison's congressional veto of state laws was defeated. And it's replaced by the Supremacy Clause and prohibitions on the states. You know, states can't coin money or make treaties. Then, Madison's Council of Revision is defeated. And it's replaced by giving the president a veto and the Supreme Court judicial review. Now, judicial review is not written into the Constitution, but I think delegates understood that it would exist. Madison wanted this Council of Revision because he thought the legislative branch would be too powerful, as the legislative branches were in the states. The president's going to be too weak to veto. The Supreme Court is going to be too weak to exercise judicial review. So let's combine those two branches in a council of revision so that they can stand up to the legislature. At the end of July, the convention appointed a committee of detail to prepare a first draft of the Constitution. Most of that committee work was done by Edmund Randolph, John Rutledge of South Carolina, and James Wilson of Pennsylvania. So that committee prepares the committee of detail draft, and it's presented to the convention in early August. This first draft of the Constitution adds some new features. It enumerates the powers of Congress for the first time, instead of giving a blanket grant of power. But it also included a necessary and proper clause to give Congress some wiggle room. This draft also included tremendous protections for the South and slavery. The international slave trade into the US would remain open forever. Slave imports and all exports could not be taxed. And it required a 3/4 supermajority in Congress to pass commercial laws, which basically would give the South a veto over commercial legislation. During August, Northerners, especially Rufus King of Massachusetts, they fight back against these pro-South, pro-slavery provisions and scale them back a little bit. Instead of remaining open forever, the slave trade could be shut down in 1808, and of course it was. Slave imports could be taxed. A bare majority, instead of a supermajority, could pass commercial laws. In return, though, the South secured one additional benefit, a fugitive slave law. And of course, the word slave itself is never used in the Constitution. It's always such persons or other persons. The presidency, the most difficult part perhaps of the whole Constitution. Would the executive be a single person or a group, a committee? How would the president be elected? How long of a term? What powers? Could the president be impeached? The dilemma, how do you create a Republicanly elected president that is a president answerable to the people, but one who is strong and independent at the same time, who has some of the qualities of monarchy? In the end, the convention goes against the whole grain of the revolution, because they created a strong, independent executive in a revolution against a strong, independent executive, the king. And why did they do that? They had a pretty good idea of who the first president was going to be, and they knew he would not abuse his power. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say the presidency is designed with Washington in mind. Now, these debates over the president, they would go in circles, because the delegates would say, well, what powers should the president have? We can't decide what powers he has until we know how he's elected. So let's talk about how he's elected. Well, we can't talk about how he's elected until we know how long his term's going to be. So let's talk about how long his term's going to be. We can't talk about how long his term's going to be until we know whether he's impeachable. Let's talk about whether he's impeachable. We can't talk about whether he's impeachable till we know what powers he has. So you just went in a circle and you're back to square one. For most of the summer, the plan was that the president would serve one 7-year term and would be elected by Congress. That's the plan into September. But the delegates were never really completely happy with that because it didn't seem like a truly independent executive. It's not until the last 2 weeks of the convention they take the presidency issue and they shove it to a committee called the Committee on Postponed Parts. And that committee redesigned the presidency, gave the president a 4-year term, made him re-electable, made him electable by the people through an electoral college. You know, a last-minute change, and what a huge change it was to create a truly independent executive. And, you know, I think it's ultimately their faith in Washington that enables them to make that leap. And I think here maybe we have the real reason for Washington's silence during the convention. So much of that summer is spent designing the presidency. And it's just not appropriate for the guy who's probably going to hold that office first to take the lead in designing it. And so Washington has to be silent. But I think it's really amazing what happens. Washington shapes the whole office of the presidency, and he does it without even saying a word. But the logic here, if the president is elected by Congress, he should probably serve one long term, or else he's dependent on that body for re-election, and that could lead to corruption. If the president is elected by the people, he can have a shorter term and then be re-electable. And then why the Electoral College? Well, if Congress elects, again, the president is dependent on Congress. There might be corruption or collusion involved in his re-election. So let the people elect the president. But the problem with the people electing the president is there was this idea that the people really only know candidates in their own state. They're going to vote for favorite sons. Nobody's going to get a majority. Every election is going to have to then be settled by Congress. So let's have some broader minded people. Let's have a college of electors. In the convention's closing days, George Mason of Virginia asked for the inclusion of a Bill of Rights. In their haste to wrap things up, the convention overwhelmingly voted down a Bill of Rights, and that's a big mistake that almost costs the Constitution's ratification. Now, the Articles of Confederation had no Bill of Rights because it doesn't operate on the people. The states are intermediaries between the federal government and the people. But this Constitution, this new Constitution, it's a national government. It will operate directly on the people without the states as intermediaries, so shouldn't it have a Bill of Rights? Now, the state constitutions all have bills of rights, but the state constitutions are written differently from the federal constitution. The state constitution give blanket grants of power to the states, not enumerated powers. And so with a blanket grant of powers, then you need to carve out your rights with a Bill of Rights. But this new Congress under the Constitution, it only has enumerated powers. And so you don't need a Bill of Rights. And to add a Bill of Rights would suggest that Congress can exceed its enumerated powers, and that's dangerous. And then on top of that, it's really dangerous to start listing your rights. What if you leave something out? Well, haven't you surrendered that? Madison, later on, sarcastically called a Bill of Rights, quote, a parchment barrier. It's just words on a sheet of paper. That is not going to protect minorities against a tyrannical majority. What matters is how you design the government. That's how you protect rights. You protect rights with checks and balances among the branches and levels of government. We did that already when we designed the Constitution. We built it in, and so there's no need for a Bill of Rights. And so Madison would say, look at the state constitutions. They have Bill of Rights, and they have majority tyranny, and people's rights are getting trampled in spite of the Bill of Rights. And so what's important is not this list of this sheet of paper, it's how you design and structure the government. Madison, of course, changed his mind about parchment barriers and then becomes the father of the Bill of Rights. The final Constitution, written by Gouverneur Morris, a brilliant writer and quite a character. He had a peg leg, a wooden leg, and he had a reputation as a womanizer. When he lost the leg, John Jay wrote a letter where he said, you know, it would have been better if he had lost something else in the carriage accident. So it's Morris who writes the final Constitution, the final draft, the final preamble. He's the one who organizes the Constitution into 7 articles, Article 1 on the legislature, Article 2 on the executive, and so on. The finished Constitution is signed on September 17th. So here's a fun trivia question for you. There's 55 delegates who attended at one point or another. There were 41 delegates there on the last day. 3 of them refused to sign the Constitution. So how many people signed the Constitution? Well, 41 minus 3 is 38, right? Wrong. 39 people signed the Constitution because one guy signed twice. Reed of Delaware signed his own name and then signed for John Dickinson, who was sick. Franklin's most important speech came on the last day, calling for unanimous support among the delegates. Everybody should sign. We all have our objections, but let's put our doubts aside and give this thing a chance. Franklin urged that they sign by state delegation. That way, everybody can sign in good faith, even if they're personally opposed. Well, in spite of that plea from Franklin, there were, in the end, 3 non-signers. All of them feared that the Constitution would lead to monarchy or aristocracy. And so George Mason of Virginia, non-signer. Mason was really upset by his double loss. Mason wanted the slave trade closed, and he wanted the supermajority for commercial laws, and he lost on both. Excuse me. And so Mason, among other things, he's afraid that the South is going to become a minority within the nation. And in a way, it seems to me, Mason is sort of foreshadowing John C. Calhoun or the Southern secessionists. Edmund Randolph, non-signer. He wanted the states to propose amendments to be considered by a second constitutional convention. You know, to me, it's amazing that Randolph is a non-signer. He was the one who introduced the Virginia Plan. He was the one who wrote the first draft in the Committee of Detail, and then he ends up a non-signer. And then the third non-signer, Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts. Gerry wanted greater protections against a standing army. Gerry favored a provision in the Constitution that would have limited the US military to 3,000 men. Anything beyond that is too dangerous. Now, supposedly, according to tradition, but I've never found a reliable primary source to back this up, supposedly, when Gerry moves that the US military not exceed 3,000 men, Washington moves no invasion of the United States ever exceeds 3,000 men. Well, that was the end of Gary's proposal. As the delegates are signing the completed Constitution, Franklin points to the back of Washington's chair. And he says, you know, when artists do their work, they have a very hard time distinguishing a rising sun from a setting sun. How do you paint the difference between a sunrise and a sunset? And so Franklin says, I'm staring at this sun all summer long, trying to figure out, is this a rising sun or a setting sun? Now I know it's a rising sun. But of course, Franklin spoke prematurely because ratification was going to be, you know, a very iffy struggle. As Franklin was heading home from the convention on the last day, this lady stops him, Elizabeth Powell, wife of the mayor of Philadelphia. And she says, well, doctor, have we got a republic or a monarchy? And of course, Franklin's response, well, my dear, a republic if you can keep it. And so the founders launched this experiment in Republican government. It's going to be a struggle. It's going to be up to the American people to make it work. I don't think it's really clear that the experiment is a success until the end of the Civil War. And then it's finally demonstrated that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. So I want to wrap this up with a wonderful little historical tidbit. On September 14th, 1787, which is not the last day of the convention, it's like the Friday before the convention ended, the Philadelphia Light Horse Cavalry held a dinner in honor of Washington at the City Tavern on 2nd Street. This is not the original building, but it is an exact reproduction that was built in 1976 for the bicentennial at the exact original location. So I want to share with you the final bill for that evening. Dinners for 55 gentlemen, 20 pounds sterling. 54 bottles of Madeira, 20 pounds. 60 bottles of claret, 21 pounds. 8 bottles old stock, 3 pounds. 22 bottles of porter, 2 pounds. 8 bottles of cider, 1 pound. 12 bottles of beer, 1 pound. 7 large bowls of punch, 4 pounds. Cigars, 2 pounds. Wine glasses broken, 1 pound. Dinners for 16 musicians, 2 pounds. 16 bottles of claret for musicians, 5 pounds. 5 bottles of Madeira for musicians, 1 pound. 7 bowls of punch for musicians, 2 pounds. For a grand total of 89 pounds sterling. That's 3 bottles of alcohol per person, plus all the punch. And 89 pounds, obviously a lot of money. It's about $15,000 in today's dollars. And so these men definitely knew how to celebrate a job well done. Now the musicians, let me just share some of their names with you and figure out who they are. George Christliff, Mr. Schultz, Mr. Treninger, John Kaiser, William Hartung, David Rotti, David Kartzrock, John Brunner, Conrad Spangenberg. Well, obviously they're all Germans, right? Who were they and how did they get here? They were originally Hessian mercenaries, sent here by the British to fight. George Washington captures 900 of them in the Battle of Trenton and offers them amnesty, become American citizens, and many did. And many settled in the Germantown section of Philadelphia, which is where my university, LaSalle University, is today. So it's, you know, it's a wonderful American immigration story. These guys come here to fight George Washington, and they end up playing their instruments in honor of him at the Constitutional Convention. All right, that's it. Thank you.
Well, Stuart, we've got a couple of really good questions. One comes, and then there's another one that if John doesn't mind responding to that, maybe that third one. The first one is Christine Kodonsky once asked, you were talking about property being a defining a criteria in representation. Christine wants to know if there were other ways for property to be reflected in representation discussed at Philadelphia.
Well, you know, they go back and forth on this quite a bit. And, you know, the big issue is slavery, but people point out all the inconsistencies. You know, if are slaves people, then give them a full vote. If they're property, they don't get any vote. If slaves count as property, why doesn't other property count? Another area where this comes up is Governor Morris. He wants property qualifications in order to vote, because he feels, you know, it's the people with property who are going to be paying the tax bill and funding everything that this government does. And so they should have the biggest say in you know, the money. You know, Morris is afraid that poor people will levy all these taxes that rich people will pay to do all these things that, you know, property people don't necessarily want to do. So it does come up in a variety of ways in the convention, and, you know, going all the way back to the Virginia plan, where it's going to be, are we going to base representation on just free population alone, or is it going to be taxes paid?
And in under the articles, there were self-assessment of land values that was to be the basis of their contributions too. So that land values was around in people's minds before the convention.
Can I comment on this?
Oh,
Tim?
sure.
The fact of the matter is that virtually every state required property holdings for suffrage. And so the convention found that a difficult proposition, how to come up with a federal and national suffrage qualification. And so what they did was they put in that the states could determine the qualification of voters for the House of Representatives. And so the property qualification, although not specifically mentioned in the Constitution, is there, but it allows the state legislatures to determine what the property qualification would be for those people voting in the states for federal representation.
And then another debate is whether you should have a property requirement to hold office in the federal government. And that, you know, that's something that Morris was also, as I recall, in favor of, but that's something they decide against.
Mike Ellery had a question about one of the letters that we had in the personal letters discussion. William Blount speculates that once this Constitution is ratified, he speculates that it's going to, we should have had a phase where we'd have smaller countries, and then eventually a larger country would emerge from the smaller countries. Mike wants to know, can you shed any more light on that letter?
Well, one thing I would say about Blount is, on the Friday before the convention adjourned, there were 4 guys who were not going to sign, and Blount was one of them. And then he's the only one, it seems, who was budged by Franklin's speech, and he feels, okay, now I can sign. So he was on the verge of being a non-signer. You know, but there is talk, if the convention does break up, you know, is it going to be regional confederacies? Is it going to be North versus South? You know, that sort of thing.
And that would also show up in some of the occasionally would show up in some of the ratification documents as well. John, Stuart made reference to the bitter Madison, totally frustrated with his performance and what he wanted. And I know there's this really remarkable letter that he eventually, in October, writes to Jefferson that I think you might want to comment on the quote bitter Madison idea.
Yes, he he has a long-standing correspondence with Jefferson, and he says to Jefferson during the sitting of the Constitutional Convention that he can't tell him what's going on because of the secrecy rule. He says, as soon as the convention's over, I'll write to you. Well, it takes him about 6 weeks to come around to write that letter on the 24th of October. And he has a PS that he puts in it on the 1st of November. So it doesn't get it sent out until that time. But in that letter, he spells out what the convention did. And he calls it a digression. And it's a very long digression in which he talks about the idea of a congressional veto over state laws. And he wanted that. He wanted a full-scale congressional veto over state laws, not what was in the Virginia plan, which called for a congressional veto over state laws that are in contravention of the federal Constitution. So even his own delegation wouldn't go as far as Madison wanted to go, giving Congress the complete authority over a veto over state laws. Although he did propose that the Council of Revision could reject a congressional veto over a state law if Congress went too far. The Council of Revision would say that is not valid. And so Madison writes this letter to Jefferson, in which he shows his dismay that congressional veto over state laws is eliminated, and how important he thinks that was.
Any other quick questions from anybody before we go to the second document discussion session? Dan Hefts wants to know who picked up the tab for the dinner.
So, that's a great question. I assume the hosts, which was the Philadelphia Light Horse Cavalry. And, the document says dinners for 55 gentlemen. I mean, that just so happens to be the number of delegates to the convention, but I don't think that's, I'm sure many delegates were there, but that's not the reason it's 55. I think that's just coincidence.
Do we know if any of them were teetotalers?
Doesn't sound like it.
Right. Well, thank you. Let's, Lily, if you could move us into the discussion groups.